our CPD activity now will follow. The launch ceremony is over. So we have two eminent speakers who, of course, we were sort of we were trying to get some CV on them, but then apparently they were really not that interested in providing all the details of what they are good at or what it is. So anyway, going by the qualifications which they have given, and of course by the subjects. First, the dyslipidemia, how I treat dyslipidemia, probably you will be able to practice it tomorrow itself, because it is such a common problem and hardly a day passes of where you will not see a dyslipidemia patient. And of course, the thing is, most of the time patients come with their own self-referrals through this problem, because it is such a very well-known problem. So they will want it to be tackled. So probably I think we would be taken through this exercise by Dr. Tushara Matthias, so that she will share her expertise on this subject, so that we would be able to provide a better and probably evidence-based service from tomorrow. Thank you, Dr. Matthias. Please come.
Good evening. So I'll be talking about dyslipidemia. As you know, it's one of the commonest problems that we encounter in our clinical practice. And over the next 20 to 30 minutes, I plan on taking you through some of the new developments in the area, mostly concentrating on the recent most guidelines. Okay, so the lecture will be divided into 4 parts. What is new in these areas? Who and how to screen, how to evaluate the risk, when to initiate treatment, and monitoring and surveillance. So when it comes to the screening of dyslipidemia, recently there is a thought process that fasting lipid profile is not essential in almost all adult patients, and that non-fasting lipid profile is equally good for most adult patients. The reason being, there is a lot of evidence base which suggests that between the fasting and the non-fasting, there is hardly a difference in most lipid components, which are enough to add clinical significance. The only component which has a big difference is a triglyceride. Even that has only about 26 milligrams per deciliter. So for most adult patients that you find in your practice, a non-fasting lipid profile is actually equally good as a fasting lipid profile. So, but having said that, the fasting lipid profile becomes important in a certain group of patients. The group of patients in whom the fasting becomes important is if you're suspecting familial hypercholesteremia. You know, familial hypercholesteremia is an entity where patients have primary hypercholesteremia. So we generally suspect primary hypercholesteremia if patients have premature heart diseases. By premature, I mean in males is less than 55 and in females is less than 60. And the other indication where a fasting lipid profile might become important is if you're specially monitoring the patient for hypertriglyceridemia. As I told you before, triglyceride is the one that has significant difference between the fasting and non-fasting. So if you're monitoring somebody for hypertriglyceridemia, then the fasting lipid profile becomes important. Why is there a big difference? Like, why are we talking about this in clinical practice? In the sense, why are we talking about fasting versus non-fasting? The benefits of non-fasting lipid profile are, you know, most of the time patients say, doctor, I could not fast for 10 hours, I could not fast for 12 hours. So because of that, I didn't do the lipid profile. So, you know, if non-fasting lipid profile is equally good as fasting lipid profile, you can actually tell them to do the lipid profile at the same time that they do their HbA1c to see the control of diabetes. So there might be better patient compliance in doing the routine test for lipid profile, by which means we will get the lipid profiles on time and we can actually intensify their therapy and get them onto their treatment targets if they actually do not have to fast. The other thing is patients will not have the risk of going into hypoglycemia if they're diabetic patients, and the convenience of the patient. They will just walk in and get the test done when it's possible. Having said that, you might be wondering, does the non-fasting predict the cardiovascular disease risk the same as fasting? Well, there's a lot of evidence to say that the cardiovascular disease risk prediction is equally good in fasting and non-fasting. So for most patients, non-fasting should be okay. Apart from the standard lipid profile, I'd like to talk to you about two other tests that we are encouraged to do in the recent most guidelines. One is the lipoprotein A or lipoprotein small a. So this is a test that is available in the private sector for about 6,500 rupees. So this lipoprotein small a is a molecule that is present in all of us. And it usually is constant throughout the lifetime of a patient. And it is usually genetically modified. So the level remains constant throughout a person's lifetime. And the recent most guidelines recommend that we at least do this lipoprotein small a once in a patient's lifetime. You might be wondering, why do you have to do this lipoprotein small a by spending about 6,500 rupees? Well, for a patient who has a high level of lipoprotein A, the risk of cardiovascular disease risk is high. So you get an idea that if lipoprotein is high, that patient actually needs aggressive monitoring and aggressive treatment of the risk factors. So that is a thing that will actually even motivate the patient if they know that their LPA is high, that they actually have to monitor and treat their risk factors very carefully. Why I say that is because as at present, there is no specific treatment modality to bring the lipoprotein A level down. You only know that it's high, and by knowing that it's high, you try to control the risk factors, the standard lipid profile as well as the other risk factors. But there is no specific treatment to bring the lipoprotein A, which is used in clinical practice. So by doing lipoprotein A, in practice, we would generally do lipoprotein A in patients who have a premature history of cardiovascular disease. As I told you before, that is less than 55 for a male and less than 60 for a female. And also, sometimes we are not sure whether to start a statin or not. The patient is somewhere in between moderate and high risk. So when we have that clinical doubt, we can do the lipoprotein small a, and if it is high, you know that your decision is more tilted towards starting the patient on a statin. So that helps you in your decision making. And the ESC 2019 guideline says that at least once in a patient's lifetime to do the lipoprotein A level, because it gives you idea about your cardiovascular risk. The second molecule I like to talk to you about, the test is apolipoprotein B. So apolipoprotein B is again available in the private sector. It's about 4,500 rupees. Why we need to do apolipoprotein B is, now sometimes patients actually are at their LDL targets. Their LDLs are about 70, 50, but they still have a high risk of cardiovascular disease risk. They get attacks. So in that kind of patients, the thought process is that there are small and dense LDL particles. So despite the LDL level being normal, the small and dense LDL particles actually are very atherogenic. To find out this residual risk, we can actually do apolipoprotein B. So we generally do apolipoprotein B in our clinical practice in diabetes, in patients who are obese, in patients who have high triglyceride. In those patients, we do apolipoprotein B because we can identify the residual risk. So having spoken to you about the screening test that we can engage for dyslipidemia, how do you evaluate the risk? Most of the time, our patients come with their lipid profiles done by themselves, and they ask what needs to be done. Okay, so I have given you two clinical scenarios, like a patient, a 45-year-old patient with no illnesses coming to you with total cholesterol of 315, LDL of 228 and triglyceride of 446. Whether you're going to start statin for this patient or not. The second one is a 50-year-old patient with a total cholesterol of 300 and LDL of 150. So can you make your decision based on this? The answer is yes as well as no, because based on only the lipid profile, you can't make your treatment decision about statins. So there is a concept that is cardiovascular disease risk of a patient. Generally, the treatment decision to start statin depends on this concept. You have to calculate the cardiovascular disease risk of that particular patient. So a cardiovascular disease risk of a patient means the likelihood of a patient developing an atherosclerotic cardiovascular event over a defined period. And generally, the cardiovascular disease risk that we calculate is for 10 years. So there are many scoring systems that we can use, and all over the world, there are lots of scoring systems. And in practice, actually, we also use some of these scoring systems because the scoring system that the Ministry of Health recommends to us is the WHO ISH scoring system, which does not come in an app. So you can't use it when the patient is in front of you. It comes in a chart, which you have to refer. So it is not practical to use that chart in front of a patient. So we generally use one of the other calculators, which is actually not right, because for our population, these other scoring systems are not validated. So in the Europe, you have the SCO scoring system. In America, you have the ASCVD. And in UK, we have this QRIS-3. So the Ministry of Health of Sri Lanka, even in the recent most dyslipidemia guideline that they have formulated, which I was part of it, recommends the WHO ISH scoring system. But unfortunately, at the moment, at the point of care of patient, we don't have an app, so we can't use it. So this is how the ASCVD looks like. There is an app, and even on Google, you can just Google and find the ASCVD. You enter this data of the patient, and then you get a risk. You get a numerical number, which you can actually explain to the patient. Then this is the WHO chart I told you about. So this is how the WHO chart looks like. So it's very cumbersome to actually use it when the patient is sitting in front of you. You have to look and match the areas and then find the risk of the patient. So we use a surrogate marker by using other scoring systems. Okay, so their scoring systems, after you use them, the patient's cardiovascular disease risk, you categorize the patient into very high risk, moderate risk, like that. So you can't remember it offhand. You actually need to have an app or a reference for it to see which risk category the patient belongs to. So if you have the app, you enter all the data, and then you know what risk category the patient belongs to. So this is the ESC categorization of it, of the risk categories. Okay, so why we need to use this CVD risk in practice is, like sometimes when we say, okay, your cholesterol is high, the patients sometimes ask us, doctor, if I start on the pill, do I have to take it lifelong? Can I stop it at one point? Can I try it after 3 months and see, repeat and see? They have a lot of questions. They don't want to take statins most of the time because of fear of adverse effects. So when in such a situation, if you want to explain to the patient what their cardiovascular disease risk is, having this numerical value is actually helpful. For example, if you put in a patient's data and you find the 10-year risk is 10%, and you tell the patient, look here, your 10-year risk is 10%. That means 10 patients out of 100 patients can suffer a heart attack, and you have a 10% chance of getting a heart attack over the next 10 years. So if you tell that to the patient, they understand in their terms that what the risk means. So it's a numerical number that the patient can relate to. And that also helps you in encouraging them, if they need risk factor modification, to actually modify the risk factors. So that's a good tool to have. You tell the patient, this is your risk. That's why you need to cut down on certain risk factors. Having said that, the CVD risk calculation is not needed if a person has already suffered a heart attack, a stroke, or any other cardiovascular event like that, that you actually don't have to calculate the risk. So the CVD risk calculation is for a patient who has not suffered a heart attack or a stroke or any major event of that sort. Only for patients who generally come into our practice without any of these events already happening. So for those patients only, we need to calculate the risk. Apart from that, if the patient is known to have familial hypercholesteremia, we again don't have to calculate the risk, because the risk is very high. So you don't need another number to tell the patient the risk is high. The other problem with the CVD risk is, now these scoring systems take in only certain data. You can't enter all risk factors about the patient into the scoring system. So because of that, these scoring systems are not foolproof. So they have problems with them. So despite having a score for a patient, there are certain other risk enhancing factors which actually increase the patient's risk beyond this number that you get from your calculator. So if the patient has fatty liver, if the patient has familial hypercholesteremia, if the patient has metabolic syndrome, if the patient is known to have PIH in their previous pregnancies, all these things actually increase the patient's risk. So as always in clinical practice, we have to put everything together and then only make the treatment decision about the statin therapy. It's not the risk alone, though it's a good thing to calculate the risk so that we don't inadvertently start statin therapy for actually patients who do not need it. So when do you initiate treatment? Now that you've looked at the lipid profile, you've calculated the cardiovascular disease risk, you looked at the patient as a whole about their risk factors, when do you start treatment? So when it comes to statin treatment, you have two arms. One is primary prevention and one is secondary prevention. Primary prevention means in a patient who's never suffered a MI or a stroke, we are going to start statin to prevent these events. And secondary prevention means those who have suffered those clinical events, we try to control their statin so that they don't get a recurrence of the events. So who do we start primary prevention? That means it's a healthy patient, he comes to you with a lipid profile. When do you start statin? So one of the indications which you can decide based on the lipid profile is if the LDL, absolute value of the LDL, is more than 190. So if the LDL is more than 190 and the patient has no other risk factors, you would start the patient on a statin because the LDL is very high. Having said that, you have to always exclude the secondary causes of dyslipidemia. The other condition where you would start primary prevention is if you put the patient's data into a scoring system and the patient's data indicates the patient is at high risk for cardiovascular disease. The other common indication is type 2 diabetes mellitus. What do you all do? Do you start statin for all patients with type 2 diabetes mellitus or only for some patients? Do you routinely give a statin for all patients with diabetes? That question is answered in two different ways. The Americans believe that all patients with type 2 diabetes mellitus more than 40 years who have LDL more than 70 years need to be on a moderate intensity statin. That means if a diabetic patient above 40 years comes to you and his LDL is more than 70, you would give him a statin. Whereas the NICE guidelines, the latest guideline in 2020 June, they believe that you have to calculate their risk and then only give a statin if they're high risk. But the Sri Lankan guideline also recommends, we are going with the American guidelines, and we recommend that for all diabetic patients more than 40 years, if their LDL is more than 70 milligrams per deciliter, you would give them a moderate intensity statin. You're not going to calculate the risk, but you would just start them on a statin for risk prevention. So the primary prevention of these patients who have LDL more than 190, as well as the diabetic patients, once you start statin, what is the target that you're going to arrive at? What do you tell the patient you have to bring the LDL down to? If the patient is at very high risk, we would try to bring the LDL to 55. But if the patient is at high risk, we try to bring the patient to 70. This very high risk and high risk comes from that scoring systems I spoke to you about. Then we come to the second arm, that is when we give statins for patients who have already had a stroke or a MI. So for patients who have already had a stroke or a MI, the LDL target generally that we come to is 55 or 50% less than what they had at baseline. So now it's much lower than what it used to be. About 3 years back, it used to be 70. Now what they recommend is you come down to 55. It is not too low, you come down to 55. So that's the current recommendation. And if a patient has another MI or a stroke within 2 years of the first one, you bring the LDL down even further to about 40. So why are we talking about targets so much? Is it really important for the patient to come down to this 55 or 70? Well, the answer comes from a lot of meta-analysis, and one of the famous meta-analysis is by the cholesterol treatment trialist group, which did the meta-analysis in 2012. And what they said was, for every 1 millimolar reduction in LDL, you would reduce the major vascular event by 21%. So if somebody asks you, if a patient asks you, do I really have to come down to this target? That's something that you can actually tell the patient. For every LDL of 1 millimolar reduction, you would bring down major vascular events by 21%. So that's a significant improvement. So this is by a meta-analysis. So the data is quite solid. And this is by one of the most famous groups who are used to doing trials on dyslipidemia. That is a cholesterol treatment trialist group. So you can actually tell the patient, you bring it down by 1 millimole even, that reduces about 21% of the major vascular events. So that's a significant benefit to talk about. Having spoken so much about targets, you wonder whether our Sri Lankan patients are at target. Well, there are a couple of studies done in Sri Lanka, one in Karapiti and one in Colombo at the Colombo South Teaching Hospital. Both trials indicate that only about 10 to 20% of our patients are actually at LDL targets in respect to their risk category. So most of our patients actually are not on target. Having said that, both these trials were done in the state sector. There are a lot of limitations in the state sector because the lipid profile, you have to get a date, the patient has to come fasting, they wouldn't take without fasting, and the date is about 2-3 weeks ahead. So the target achievement might be much lower than what it is in our private practice or non-state sector. So the reasons for not achieving target in these studies are mainly because of clinical inertia. Clinical inertia is on the part of the practitioner, that is us, because we don't do the lipid profile often enough and then intensify their therapy in order to see that the patient comes to these targets. The second one applies only to the state sector, that is poor resources and testing limitations. So once you start a patient on statin, say you decide on the CVD risk, put the patient on statin therapy, you send the patient home, when do you get it back? So after about 8 weeks, generally you repeat the lipid profile to see whether the patient has come back to target. So if the target is not achieved, we generally try to intensify their statin therapy. What do I mean by intensify their statin therapy? When we talk about statins in general, there are high intensity statins and moderate intensity statins. So this is very important. If you use a high intensity statin, that is ATOA 40 to 80 or ROSUA 20 to 40, you would get an LDL reduction of 50%. Whereas if you use ATOA 10 to 20 and ROSUA 5 to 10, you would only get an LDL reduction of 30 to 40%. So there lies the difference of the intensity. So depending on the intensity that you want the patient to reduce their cholesterol, you would give the statin therapy. So it's not just a random dosage that we give. So it depends on the number that we want the patient to, the reduction that we expect. So if you want a larger reduction like 50%, you have to give a higher dose of ATOA 40 or ROSUA 20. Or if you want a smaller reduction, then you can give either ATOA 20 or ROSUA 10. So sometimes patients ask, which is better? Is ATOA better or ROSUA better? Well, in clinical practice, there is not much of a difference between the two, but there are certain indications where you might use one over the other. So usually atorvastatin does not need any dose adjustment in kidney failure patients. So if the patient has renal failure, there is no dose adjustment needed in atorvastatin. Whereas rosuvastatin, you need to adjust the dose if they have renal failure. And the other thing is, in chronic liver disease, we would generally prefer to use either rosuvastatin or pravastatin. And generally, more than atorvastatin, rosuvastatin has less drug interactions because it is not metabolized by the cytochrome P450 system. So apart from statin, there is another drug that we combine statin therapy with in clinical practice, and that is ezetimibe. So ezetimibe will generally reduce another 15% on top of what the statin reduces. So you start a patient on statin, you send the patient home, and then after that, when they come back, if the cholesterol is not reduced enough, you can actually add on ezetimibe. Ezetimibe, what it does is it reduces the absorption of cholesterol from our gut. So it adds on another 15% reduction from what statin adds. So if statin gives 50% reduction, if you add ezetimibe onto the statin therapy, it adds on another 15% reduction from the baseline. Having spoken about the LDL target, sometimes patients ask, doctor, LDL is 55, isn't it too low? Well, there are short-term as well as long-term trials of about 6 years which say an LDL of about 40 is not harmful to the patients. So the two trial evidence are given there, even in short-term and in a follow-up study of about 6 years, LDL 40 is not at risk. So for our practice, as at the moment, there are no adverse effects of lowering the LDL to about 40 milligrams per deciliter. So how do you treat high triglyceride? That's one of the other common problems that we have in clinical practice. Most of the time, what happens is patients are put on fenofibrate. What we have to do is, the recent guidelines are slightly different in their management. Statin is the first line recommended therapy, even for hypertriglyceridemia, unless it is very high. So up to about 400 of triglycerides, statin is the first line of therapy. Even more than that, statin still becomes the first line of therapy. Once you give a statin and the patient is at their LDL target, representing their risk category, if the triglyceride is still high only, you add a fenofibrate. And there is a newer drug that is there, which is not available in Sri Lanka. It's not registered. That is icosapentaethyl acid. That is not the common omega-3 or omega-6 that patients use. This is a purified form of omega-3 that we use, and it is not available in Sri Lanka. So you give about 4 grams of that. That helps in hypertriglyceridemia. So this is not the fish oil dietary supplements that patients bring most of the time and ask whether it's okay to take. So for hypertriglyceridemia also, the first line management is statin therapy. If they're at LDL target with statin, you add ezetimibe, and the other therapy is not available in Sri Lanka. And you add fenofibrate only if they are at their LDL target. So that is the difference in the triglyceridemia management in the recent past. So sometimes patient asks, is omega-3 helpful? The omega-3 they're talking about is the fish oil dietary supplements they get from their overseas relatives. So these dietary supplements are not meant to give benefits in hypertriglyceridemia. Even for cardiovascular mortality, the evidence is very, very little. It's very weak. So as at the moment for omega-3 and omega-6, there is no reduction in cardiovascular morbidity and mortality with the available present data. They can take it for general health benefits, but for cardiovascular morbidity and mortality reduction, there is no major benefit according to the meta-analysis that has been done so far. So with regard to monitoring and surveillance, what do you do when the patient, after you start the patient on statin therapy? Well, the 2 tests that we talk about is the liver function test and the CK level. So can you start patients who have high liver function test on statin? I have sometimes seen patients are not given statin because their liver functions are high. So it's a small delay, I think, in the clicker. So when the liver functions are high, their baseline liver functions are high, sometimes because of fatty liver. So when the baseline liver functions are high, what we do is you can start statins and then monitor the liver function test. And if they're not doubling over the next 3 months, you can actually continue statins. And there is enough evidence to say that for fatty liver disease, despite their AST and ALT being 200, 300, that giving atorvastatin is not going to hurt the patient, actually is going to be beneficial for the patient. So don't refrain from using atorvastatin or another statin simply because their AST and ALT are high, because it will be helpful for them if they're having fatty liver disease. And once you start the patients on statin, you monitor the liver function test. If they're not doubling over the next 3 months, you can actually continue statin despite the AST and ALT being high. Why I say that is what statin generally causes is a transaminitis. What you mean by transaminitis is the AST and ALT are high, but the actual liver injury from statin is very, very rare. This transaminitis you can't predict. By the baseline liver function test, you can't predict. So you start the statin and see how the patient responds. The acute liver injury that occurs with statin is very, very rare. So you can give statins despite the AST and ALT being high. And generally we would do liver function test at the beginning of the therapy. If we change the dosage of the drug, we then do again liver function test, or else if the patient has a complaint, we would do liver function test while monitoring the patient. And then we talk about CK, that is creatinine kinase. We usually, if the creatinine kinase is more than 5 times the upper limit, we generally don't start statin therapy. We would look to see whether there is any cause for this high CK. And routine monitoring of CK is not necessary unless the patient complains of muscle aches and pains. So unless the patient tells you that they're having a problem, we are not going to routinely check CK because that is of no clinical value. So what we do about monitoring the CK is, if the patient complains, we do a CK. And if it is more than 10 times the upper limit, we can stop the therapy, check their renal function test, and keep monitoring the CK to see how the CK reacts. If it's less than 10 times, but with symptoms, again, you stop and you check to see whether there's any alternative cause for this high CK. So in practice, we would stop the therapy for short term if the CK is more than high, and then look to see whether there are any alternate causes. That's what we do. We take a break of about 1 month from the statin if the CK is very high, that is more than 10 times the upper limit, or less than 10 times the upper limit with the patient complaining of symptoms. So then we check to see, is there any other cause for this patient's CK to be high? Are they doing vigorous exercises? Are there any other drugs interacting? We do all of that, and we can actually restart the patient on a lower dose of statin to see where we are at, and then continue to monitor the CK and see how the patient responds. So that's what we do in practice. And ezetimibe is a good drug to be used in this stage because ezetimibe does not have the same side effect profile as statins. The muscle side effects are very much less. So because of that, in this kind of situations, combining a low dose statin with the ezetimibe might be of value. So the take-home messages from my presentation today are, statins, you have to always discuss the risk and benefit of statin therapy with the patient, because the patients know a lot nowadays. They ask you, do I have to take it continuously? Do I really have to start it now? Can I now, because of COVID, I never exercised, we never went out. Can I try it one more time and come back in 3 months? So in those cases, you will actually discuss with the patient the risk and benefit, because unless the patient is happy to take this pill every day at night, they're not going to be compliant with it. So you have to discuss with the patient the risk and benefit. That's where your CVD risk comes in. So you tell the patient what their risk is, and you discuss with the patient whether they're happy to take the statin. If they actually need it, you can actually encourage the patient to take the statin by explaining their CVD risk and explaining about the LDL reduction and the cardiovascular mortality reduction. You tell all of that to the patient and then get the patient to agree with a plan that you think is righteous by the patient. And always you have to engage the patient in dyslipidemia management, because they feel fine. Most of the dyslipidemia patients with no diabetes or cardiovascular disease, they actually feel fine. They have just done their lipid profile as a part of insurance or medical checkup or something like that. So they feel fine. So they wonder about this need to take a pill for lifelong. So in these patients, engaging the patient and telling them about their cardiovascular disease risk might be helpful if the statin is actually indicated for them. That's all. Thank you. I'll be happy to answer if there are any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Tushara, for that extremely informative lecture, which is so practical that we can start applying it from tomorrow itself. So we will have a common Q&A session after the next lecture. Also, now I invite Dr. M.R. Mubarak, MBBS, MD, FACC, FCCP and FRCP London, consultant cardiologist, Lanka Hospital, Colombo, to share his expertise on this very important topic for us. Thank you.
Mr. President, members of the Independent Medical Practitioners Association, at the outset, I'd like to thank you all for inviting me to give this lecture on management of chronic heart failure. After listening to an interesting lecture on dyslipidemia, my lecture is on the other extreme of the life. It is the beginning of the story is in the lipid abnormality. And if you don't manage your lipids in proper way, you will end up in managing heart failure. It is a very difficult job to do it in clinical practice. So what are the key learning points in my lecture? To understand the basic pathophysiology, what is heart failure, you should understand. Then you can treat the patient effectively. Clinical recognition, basic clinical recognizing the heart failure, investigating a suspected patient with heart failure. What are the basic investigations we'll be doing? And assess and manage fluid overload. That's a common problem we see in patients with heart failure, how to assess and manage. The 4 foundation drugs, you might not know, there are 4 foundation drugs described in management of heart failure, and you will understand what are these drugs and why we should give these patients should be on these 4 drugs. What are the other drugs to be used in selected groups of patients in heart failure? And what is advanced heart failure and its management and prevention strategies? And finally, you should know when to refer to a specialist at the correct time. That is important. If you delay referring patient to a specialist center for heart failure management, you will not save the patient. The patient may get worse and it will be irreversible damage to the heart. So in a case, we'll start a case. Mr. PK, 67 years, male, a retired librarian, is diabetic for 20 years, hypertension, still he smokes. He was recently diagnosed as COPD, the inverted commas, and he was started on 2 inhalers. Past history of heart attack 20 years back, he can recall. A wife tells that he had an attack and he was in the hospital for a few days. Now, basically, they have forgotten that. Worsening shortness of breath, cough, fatigue, and mild ankle swelling. And his medications are metformin, nifedipine, atorvastatin, aspirin from the medical clinic. So this is the story. We usually see a patient comes to you day-to-day practice. So how will you approach this case? What are the investigations? What are the history taking? What runs in your mind? This in your background, my lecture will follow to understand and treat and assess this patient's clinical history. So what is heart failure? It's a clinical syndrome in which the heart is unable to pump sufficient blood to meet the metabolic requirements of the body. That is important. The heart is unable to pump the metabolic requirements of the body despite normal filling pressures. That is important. Or at the expense of elevated filling pressures. That means the left atrium and the left ventricle is getting enough blood in the venous return, and it is unable to pump that out of the left ventricle or the right ventricle to the systemic circulation. That is heart failure. So it's the metabolic demand. It might change from situation to situation. Heart failure is a global pandemic affecting at least 64 million people in the world over living with heart failure. It affects nearly 2 to 3% of the general population. And heart failure is the #1 cause of hospitalization for patients aged above 65 years. As you know, the risk from the graph, we know that when you grow older and older, the prevalence increases. So it's basically a disease of old age. Management imposes heavy burden on the economy, for the patient as well as for the government. And important thing is 50% of the patients diagnosed with heart failure will not be living at the end of 5 years. The mortality is so high, it is equal to some cancers of the prostate and breast and bladder. So it's like a malignant disease. The mortality is so high. So how the heart failure begins? This is the beginning of the story. Heart failure is a progressive disorder of the heart initiated after an index event. What is that index event? I'll come to that. The index event damages to the heart muscle with a resultant loss of functioning cardiac myocyte or disrupts the ability of the myocardium to generate force. This prevents the heart from contracting normally. The index event may have an abrupt onset, a gradual onset, or a hereditary. So this diagram shows what are the index events which will create the heart failure situation in this heart. High blood pressure, diabetes, maybe a cardiomyopathy. It can be a heart attack, acute myocardial infarction, valvular heart diseases, arrhythmias, sudden arrhythmias, hereditary heart diseases like hereditary conditions, congenital heart diseases. All these can trigger the heart attack, the heart failure, and the disease can progress for many years. So response to the damage. How the heart responds to the damage. Patient may become symptomatic immediately, or the patient may become symptomatic after a long time lapse. So during that time, the patient may remain asymptomatic. Symptoms may develop immediately, something like an acute myocardial infarction. The patient may develop the symptoms immediately, or it may be taken many years, like hypertension, dyslipidemia, diabetes. Patient may be a diabetic patient going on for years and years, and they end up in the heart failure in a situation. See this graph. The patient is without symptoms on the top part of the curve, and the patient starts dropping. Admission, first episode of the heart failure, it's dropping down here, and he recovers. The heart function doesn't improve to the normal level, but it goes on for some time. And the next admission, it dips down, and the next recovers, and it dips down, and like that, recurrent hospitalization, recurrent episodes of heart failure. So this is the story. So the recurrent hospitalization will destroy the heart muscle further, and patient will die at one stage. So in each episode, each admission, the patient may not recover, or they may recover and come to a level. So during this procedure, stages of heart failure is described by the ACC/AHA, the stage A heart failure, stage B, stage C, and stage D. What is stage A heart failure? Stage A is your risk factors nearly: diabetes, hypertension, dyslipidemia, cardiomyopathy, family history. That is the stage A. So you have to manage this stage A and prevent the patient from going to stage B. Stage B is where the now patient has had a myocardial infarction. Patient had got heart muscle damage, and then this heart, still he may be asymptomatic, and it go to stage C. When it comes to stage C, he developed shortness of breath and symptoms. And stage D is the final stage of end-stage heart failure. So we have to prevent at the beginning, stage A, to prevent the patient progressing to the final stages of heart failure. So what happens when the patient develops the index event? It has a compensatory mechanism. Heart tries to compensate. Activation of the neurohormonal system and cytokine system lead to series of endogenous changes within the myocardium, which is called LV remodeling. The left ventricle undergoes remodeling. You see this diagram. Before that, I'll show the sympathetic nervous system, and renin-angiotensin aldosterone system is activated. These are the two systems activated in a patient developing heart failure. When there is myocardial injury, there is fall in left ventricular performance and sympathetic nervous system is activated. When the sympathetic nervous system is activated, it causes myocardial stimulation and it causes vasoconstriction. Renin-angiotensin system causes vasoconstriction and the aldosterone system causes sodium and water retention. So at the beginning, this is a compensatory mechanism. When time goes, this remodeling process and the cardiac muscle starts dilating and it ends up in a damage to the heart. So cardiac muscle, you can see the heart, the smaller heart, and becomes dilated and globular left ventricle shown in the picture. And the patient's compensatory mechanisms, the patient developed tachycardia, ventricular dilatation. According to Frank Starling's law, the heart starts dilating and it starts contracting according to Starling's law, and myocardial hypertrophy. The heart gets enlarged and you will see the picture of a dilated heart with tachycardia. So what are the compensatory mechanisms the body can do? This is the physiological process. The body, the ventricle, tries to produce some compounds called natriuretic peptides. These are called atrial natriuretic, B-type natriuretic and C-type natriuretic peptides. What these peptides do? This is produced by the dilated diseased ventricle. When this ventricle produces these natriuretic peptides, it causes diuresis, natriuresis. That is, the sodium is lost from the body, vasodilatation, anti-hypertrophy, anti-inflammation, and inhibition of renin-angiotensin system and the sympathetic nervous system. So this is a physiological mechanism to overcome the heart failure process taking in the body. So natriuretic peptides are useful. So we'll have to maintain the levels of natriuretic peptides. So what happens when the natriuretic peptides have a very short half-life? It may be 15 minutes, 20 minutes, and the body, it destroys this by a compound called neprilysin. So neprilysin will destroy the natriuretic peptides. So the good effects of natriuretic peptides are no longer there because it is destroyed in a short duration of time. So if we can block the neprilysin, we can increase and maintain the levels of natriuretic peptides, and that may be beneficial for the heart. This is one mode of treatment available in the current management. Just remember this neprilysin. Neprilysin is a peptide which breaks down the natriuretic peptides. Natriuretic peptides are produced by dilated ventricle. So the common natriuretic peptide which you measure in the laboratory are the B-type natriuretic peptide. So what are the clinical presentations? When you take a clinical presentation, we usually know the left heart failure. The left ventricular failure is called left heart failure. The patient comes with dyspnea, orthopnea, paroxysmal nocturnal dyspnea, the nocturnal cough, fatigue, anxiety, rales, and low saturation. These are the left ventricular failure. Usually the left ventricular failure, the presenting symptom is shortness of breath. When it comes to right ventricular failure, it's a different pathology. Fatigue, weakness, lethargy. The patient might come and say, feel lethargic and weakness. You might look for other signs: weight gain, abdominal distension, loss of appetite, right upper quadrant pain, elevated neck veins, ankle edema, hepatomegaly, and finally they become cardiac cachexia and they become thin emaciated in the long run. So this usually right heart failure is secondary to left heart failure. But sometimes there can be predominantly right heart failure in patients with pulmonary hypertension, pulmonary vascular diseases. They may present predominantly with right heart failure. So in clinical category, the New York Heart Association has classified the presentation: class 1 symptoms, class 2 symptoms, class 3 and class 4 symptoms. When you communicate with somebody, how do you communicate the patient symptom? It's a class 1 symptom means ordinary physical activity does not cause undue fatigue, palpitation, dyspnea or angina. So they are clinically normal at the normal presentation. But ordinary physical activity cause undue fatigue and palpitation, class 2 symptoms. And less than ordinary physical activity, patient can't move around in the house or move day-to-day activities, class 3 symptoms, and class 4 is the severe symptom at rest. So when you come to the heart failure classification types, this you should concentrate and remember till the end of the lecture, because my treatment schedules will go on based on this. Here you see, if the ejection fraction, the main mode of management of heart failure diagnosis is on echocardiogram. If the ejection fraction of the heart is below 40%, it's called heart failure with reduced ejection fraction. Heart failure with reduced ejection fraction, and they call it HFrEF. HFrEF. If the ejection fraction is above 50%, it's called heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. Preserved, because the ejection fraction is normal. Patient is presenting with features of heart failure, but we do an echocardiogram and EF is normal. Ejection fraction is normal, but clinically heart failure. So that is called heart failure with preserved ejection fraction, HFpEF. And there is another category, in between category, that is called mildly reduced ejection fraction, which was earlier called mid-range ejection fraction, and 40 to 49%. So you look at this picture, the picture on the top is heart failure with reduced ejection fraction. You can look at that heart, dilated, enlarged, massive heart with fibrotic muscles and a fibrotic layer and not much of muscles. That is the heart is unable to pump the blood. That is a pump failure. That is a heart failure with reduced ejection fraction. The down, the picture, the down you see, it has a very thick wall, hypertrophied wall, and it can pump well, but it cannot fill well. It's a filling abnormality. The heart cannot fill adequately to get the blood into that one. That's a diastolic dysfunction. That is called, the ejection fraction will be normal. It's the abnormalities in the diastole. So this heart is called heart failure with preserved ejection fraction, HFpEF. So when you take the diagnosis, about nearly 50% of the patients are heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. You might send for echocardiogram may be normal, but patient has presented with clinical features of heart failure. So now, sorry. So these patients are heart failure come with acute presentations. What are these acute presentations? You have a lot of diagram here, one by one. Sometimes this heart failure patient coming with acute presentation, sudden shortness of breath, had been normal all these years and sudden shortness of breath. So you have to suspect these are the following reasons. One is acute myocardial infarction. The patient has gotten a new myocardial infarction and now he is presenting with acute heart failure. It may be volume overload or weight gain. The patient would have been drinking a lot of water and or drink or alcohol, and the volume overloaded and weight gain, quick weight gain on the few days, and presenting with acute heart failure. IV fluids, it's very common. When the patient comes with lethargy, weakness, you might feel that patient is weak and they request IV fluids. When you give 500 milliliter of normal saline, they go into acute decompensation and acute shortness of breath, and the following day the patient develops paroxysmal nocturnal dyspnea and very breathless and end up in an ICU. So IV fluids, transfusions can precipitate heart failure. Non-compliance with diuretics. The patient may be having some function, wedding, not taken the diuretics, the Lasix, furosemide for a few days, and fluid loaded, and it can end up in a heart failure. Or high salt intake. Patient would have been taking a function where there had been a lot of salt food added, and they can get heart failure worsening. It may be due to aortic stenosis, ruptured chordae tendineae, arrhythmias. A patient who had been on heart failure suddenly developed an arrhythmia like atrial fibrillation. That has precipitated heart failure. Elevated sudden rise in blood pressures. Sometimes patients get blood pressures of 200, 220, and it has precipitated the heart failure. Infections, superadded infections, lung infections, anemia, COVID-19, NSAIDs, steroids. When you give patient come with some rheumatological problem, prescription of NSAIDs for 2 weeks, and patient has precipitated the heart failure. Then pregnancy can precipitate heart failure. These are the causes we should be careful when you are meddling patients with heart failure. ECG is usually abnormal in a case of heart failure, usually abnormal, more than 90%. It may show previous myocardial infarctions, left ventricular hypertrophy, conduction abnormalities like left bundle branch block, atrial fibrillation, and ventricular arrhythmias. There are 3 ECGs. One on top is clear left bundle branch block, and with a wide QRS. The QRS duration is more than 150 milliseconds in these patients. That is a common finding we might see in these patients with heart failure. The second middle ECG is atrial fibrillation. The patient has very fast, irregular heart rate. So atrial fibrillation. The third ECG is non-sustained ventricular tachycardia. That is another finding you might see. So these are the 3 categories of common ECGs which need to be treated in different situations. Chest X-ray. You might know about the chest X-ray findings, cardiomegaly, pulmonary vessel congestions. You can see curly B lines. Here you can see the upper chest X-ray, upper lobe diversion. The second lower X-ray shows the bat swing appearance, fluid overloaded lungs. So echocardiogram is the most important investigation in diagnosing heart failure category, and ejection fraction, I told you, is the calculated fraction of the parameter which will be mentioned in the all echocardiogram reports. The top figure shows dilated, poorly contracting, very low ejection fraction left ventricle. That is called heart failure with reduced ejection fraction. And the middle diagram shows IVC, that is the IVC dilated and not collapsing. So that is a feature of heart failure. And third is the lung ultrasound. Lung ultrasound is another investigation where you see the B lines, the dark lines, the dark arrows which are shown in the bottom figure. These are the rib markings, and the white ones are the lines. So that if you see 3 or more lines in a scan picture like this, it is definitely diagnostic of fluid in the excess fluid in the lungs, and heart failure is diagnostic. So now we'll come to B-type natriuretic peptides. So natriuretic peptide is a net produced by the ventricle, as I said earlier, and it can be measured. So the whole molecule is produced as a pro-BNP, and that is activated to pro-BNP, and pro-BNP has breakdown into 2 portions, then N-terminal pro-BNP and the BNP. These 2 can be measured. As I said, the BNP is the active molecule, and it has a half-life of 15 to 20 minutes. And the NT-pro-BNP particle has a half-life of 90 minutes. So the different labs measure BNP or NT-pro-BNP, and we are interpreting results. You should be careful that BNP levels are less than NT-pro-BNP values, because NT-pro-BNP has a long half-life and it stays longer time in the blood, and it has a higher values, nearly 3 to 5 times higher than the BNP values. So the lab will if you request, sometimes you might give BNP level, sometimes you might give NT-pro-BNP levels. So according to that, if the NT-pro-BNP or pro-BNP levels are higher, it definitely diagnostic of heart failure. So that is the diagnostic test in heart failure. We do it in heart failure. Echocardiogram, NT-pro-BNP, this is the protocol. I have given it up, it's in the website. But you have to have cautious when you are taking these natriuretic peptides. There are many causes which can increase the natriuretic peptides in the blood. Heart failure, right heart failure 1, acute coronary syndromes, heart muscle diseases, left ventricular hypertrophy, valvular heart disease, pericardial disease, atrial fibrillation, myocarditis, cardiac surgery, and cardioversion. That can increase the levels of natriuretic peptide. And there are non-cardiac causes. Advancing age, older people may have higher values of natriuretic peptides. Anemia, renal failure, because the excretion is delayed. Pulmonary causes like obstructive sleep apnea, pneumonia, pulmonary hypertension, critical illness, septic patients, severe burns, toxic insults, even envenomation and cancer chemotherapy, you can elevate the natriuretic peptide. So when you are interpreting results, you have to exclude these causes and be very cautious when you are diagnosing heart failure on levels of natriuretic peptides. So in a patient suspected of heart failure in front of you, and what are the basic investigations? You might need an ECG, because ECG is important. 90% of the time might show ECG telltale story of heart failure. Chest X-ray important, BNP or NT-pro-BNP, not both. You have to do one test, NT-BNP or pro-BNP. Troponins to show any myocardial ischemia. Blood gas will be helpful. Renal functions, heart failure patients, there is cardiorenal syndrome. It can be deranged. Therefore, you have to look for creatinine and electrolytes. Blood count is important. Hemoglobin is important. If the hemoglobin is low, you have to do iron studies to look for iron deficiency anemia, or it is chronic diseases. Blood sugars, thyroid, liver functions, and lipid profile. These are the basic investigations on that side. And you have the special investigations. The echocardiogram is the important investigation which should be done to diagnose, and the coronary angiogram may be necessary to exclude ischemia. Sometimes we might do exercise testing to see the exercise capacity, cardiac MRI, cardiac CT, CAT studies to find out there is, and EMB's endomyocardial biopsy in diagnosing cardiomyopathies, some cardiomyopathies. So these are the major clinical trials. Heart failure is a disease where many trials are proven. Major trials starting from 1986 up to 2021, major trials have shown, many drug trials have shown benefit and reduced mortality, reduced hospitalization in heart failure. So in management of heart failure, there are 4 objectives which should satisfy. First thing is patient has shortness of breath, dyspnea coming with fluid overload. So you have to treat the patient. First thing is improve symptoms. That doesn't treat the story because he might come again. So then next admission can cause increased renin secretion. So increased renin secretion, increased renin cause increased angiotensin 2, increased aldosterone, sodium water retention, and that increases cardiac filling. This is how the compensatory mechanisms takes place. So it's damaging to the heart, because why it's damaging? More in sympathetic activity, increases vasoconstriction, increased cardiac filling, but angiotensin, sodium water retention, and heart gets enlarged. Cardiac remodeling by aldosterone. And now what you can do is you can block the sympathetic activity with beta blockers. So patients, we are given beta blockers. What you are doing is you are blocking the sympathetic activity. So beta blockers becomes an important role in the management of chronic heart failure. The renin, you block the renin to angiotensin 2. You have to give AC inhibitors. So that is another drug important in the heart failure, lifeline of the management of heart failure. If the patient cannot tolerate AC inhibitors, some of them have side effects, then you can do angiotensin receptor blocker, ARBs. And next important group is the mineralocorticoid receptor antigens. Those are spironolactone drugs, spironolactone. So that is another drug which is important in the heart failure, right? And next, diuretics at this stage, sodium water retention to cause diuresis, reduce cardiac filling by diuretics. And there is a lot of vasoconstriction, increase the workload of the heart, you boost vasodilate it, you give vasodilators, nitrates, hydralazine, and other drugs. So these are the mechanism, pathophysiology of heart failure management. I hope you would have understood the basic understanding. So in a patient with heart failure, should be on beta blockers, should be on AC inhibitors, if not ARBs, and mineralocorticoids, spironolactone, and diuretics. Just giving diuretics alone will not serve the purpose. He will get better that day, following day he will come back with again. You increase the dose of diuretics, Lasix you increase, and again they come back, and finally it doesn't work. So the pathophysiology you should understand, these patients should be on beta blockers, AC inhibitors or ARBs, and spironolactone. These are the drugs with diuretics. So management of fluid overload. So when a patient comes, as I said, in an acute fluid overload, the important drug is IV furosemide. You can give bolus doses, 20 milligram, 40 milligram, and if they cannot tolerate bolus doses, infusions, and you can change to oral when they are offloaded. Fluid restriction is important. Fluid restriction. Otherwise, if they go home, when they see that they are passing more urine, they try to compensate by drinking more water. You are trying to offload him by passing 2 liters, 3 liters, and they go home and drink about 5 liters. That is what happens. Then your diuretic doesn't work, right? So you have to see that the fluid is restricted and monitor the fluid balance. Always check them to tell the fluid balance and check how much you are drinking, how much you are passing urine, and salt restriction and daily weight is important. If they gain weight drastically faster, about 5 pounds in a week, that means they are drinking a lot and there is no fluid loss. If sometimes this IV furosemide loop diuretics may not work, in that case you can combine a thiazide or thiazide diuretics. That is metolazone, hydrochlorothiazide. So that's a 2A indication. Monitor perfusion, heart rate, blood pressure, and check renal functions, always just put on diuretics. You might end up in a patient with hyponatremia or hypokalemia and you have more problems. So check urea, creatinine, electrolytes. Sometimes diuretics may not work. You may have to do ultrafiltrations. And routine use of opiates is not recommended in these patients with heart failure. You don't generally recommend morphine to these patients as we did in the past. So in evidence-based medical therapy, AC inhibitors, you can see this is an old slide which was done long time ago, nearly 10 years ago, but I just want to understand what is this evidence-based medical therapy and relative risk reduction in heart failure mortality. When you give AC inhibitors, they have found 23% mortality reduction, relative risk reduction. ARNI, another drug, angiotensin receptor neprilysin inhibitor, 16%. Mineralocorticoid receptor antagonist, 30%. Beta blocker, 34%. And SGLT2 inhibitors, 17% have shown. So all these have cumulative risk reduction. So just putting a patient on one drug is not enough. You have to give combination of these drugs. So in combination, I will come to the recommended combinations. You have to be careful in combining these drugs. So there are 4 foundation drugs. Here you can see the 4 foundation drugs. In a patient with a heart failure with reduced ejection fraction, on one group you have the AC inhibitors or ARBs or ARNI, ARNY. I come to that. Angiotensin receptor neprilysin inhibitor. One of those drugs, not all 3. One in that pillar. The next pillar is beta blocker. Should be on beta blockers, not all beta blockers, selected beta blockers. MRA is spironolactone. And the next is important is it's a diabetic drug and now it has ended up in a cardiac drug in the hands of the cardiologist. That is a SGLT2 inhibitors. That is another drug which should be on all heart failure patients. So the 4 foundation drugs. So because considering these things, the European Society of Cardiology in August this year recommended these 4 drugs, these 4 group of drugs, these 5 groups of drugs as their first line treatment in the management of heart failure. We'll go one by one. An AC inhibitor is recommended for patient with heart failure with reduced ejection fraction, that is HFrEF, to reduce the risk of heart failure, hospitalization and death. So that is why it reduces hospitalization, it reduces the death and it serves our purpose. Second is a beta blocker, class 1A indication. Third is MRA. MRA means spironolactone. Next is dapagliflozin or empagliflozins are recommended for patient with heart failure, all 1A indications. Another class 1 indication drug, sacubitril valsartan. Sacubitril valsartan is recommended replacement for AC inhibitor. That is a patient who is not on AC inhibitors or ARB only should be given this drug, and it is another group where the sacubitril, I will come to that in a while. And all these 4 classes of drugs are essential filler basic drugs should be on research. Now we'll go one by one. AC inhibitors and ARBs. Sorry. AC inhibitors and ARBs, you all know it's an old drug. AC inhibitors. You can see the trial consensus and SALT where enalapril had been used. It reduces preload, afterload, vasodilatation, and improves systolic function, facilitates salt and water excretion by kidneys, and reduce LVH, myocardial fibrosis, and stiffness. The drugs are captopril, enalapril, lisinopril, ramipril. These are usual AC inhibitors. Recommendation is start with a lower dose. And gradually, according to the patient response, come to the target dose. That is important. Start with a lower up to the maximum dose. And if the patient cannot tolerate AC inhibitors, they should be given angiotensin receptor blockers. There are 3 angiotensin receptor blockers, candesartan, losartan, and valsartan. These start with a lower dose and go this. You don't give both drugs. Both drugs will cause increased side effects and hyperkalemia. So you give either AC inhibitors or ARBs. That is the one pillar of the foundation. The next drug is neprilysin inhibitor, ARNI, angiotensin receptor neprilysin inhibitor. This is a combination of a drug which I told you we are blocking the neprilysin. Neprilysin is the one which is destroying the peptides. the ANP, BNP, and these peptides are destroyed by neprilysin. This neprilysin, if you can block the neprilysin, the peptides are beneficial to our patients, the ANP, BNP, and CNP. So neprilysin inhibitor is called the drug neprilysin inhibitor ANI, angiotensin receptor neprilysin inhibitor. So, but important thing about this drug is you don't combine this drug with AC inhibitors or ARBs, right? Don't combine. Never combine. If the patient is on AC inhibitors, if you want to give angiotensin receptor neprilysin inhibitor, the ANI drug, that is called sacubitril/valsartan, the combination sacubitril/valsartan, you have to stop the AC inhibitors for 3 days, 36 hours, and then start this drug. That is the important thing. If the patient is on ARB, you can straight away convert it into ANI, sacubitril/valsartan. So sacubitril/valsartan is a combination drug available in 3 strengths, 50 milligram, 100 milligram, and 200 milligram. It has combinations, and this drug is marketed and FDA approved, and it is contraindicated to concomitant use with an AC inhibitor. It's switching from ACE allow washout period of 36 hours, and renal and liver diseases are important. So this is a drug which is not registered in Sri Lanka, but it is worldwide, it is used, and it is a very good drug in the management of heart failure. Beta blockers. Only 3 beta blockers are approved in heart failure. Now you know you should use beta blockers as a first-line therapy, and 3 beta blockers. Number 1, bisoprolol. Beta-1 selective, that is cardioselective beta blocker. That is the one which we mostly use in our patients. And another drug recommended is the metoprolol succinate. You have to remember it is not the plain metoprolol. Metoprolol, normal metoprolol, plain metoprolol is metoprolol tartrate. That is not recommended in heart failure. Here you have to use metoprolol succinate sustained release. That is beta-1 selective. So it is the sustained release. Long-acting metoprolol succinate should be used. Do not use the plain metoprolol, which is metoprolol tartrate in heart failure patient. That will worsen their symptoms. Next drug is the carvedilol, beta-1, beta-2 selective and alpha blocking agent. Beta-1, beta-2 and alpha-1 blocking agents. So this is a alpha beta blocking agents, carvedilol. So these 3 drugs are used in trials and all spectrum of heart failure from mild to severe heart failure. We do not use atenolol, other drugs like propranolol in heart failure. In those days, beta blockers were said to contraindicated in heart failure. That is before we understood the pathophysiology of heart failure. At that time, when we diagnose a case of heart failure, we used to stop the beta blockers, right? So now choosing the right beta blocker. So beta blocker remains the mainstay of treatment in our patients. You usually stick to bisoprolol. We are compatible with bisoprolol. But in America, they mostly use metoprolol succinate. And some countries we use carvedilol. So all these drugs are recommended, but metoprolol, it is succinate. So when you start with bisoprolol, the trial, CBIS-2 trial shows wide variation in mortality, and the starting dose is 1.25 milligram once daily. You remember 1.25 milligram once daily. You don't just go and give 10 milligram bisoprolol to this patient. Start with 1.25, titrate it gradually. Every 2 weeks, 1.25 milligram BD, 2.5 milligram BD, 5 milligram BD, like that, you come to the maximum dose. And otherwise, if you start with a higher dose, patient will get symptomatic and heart failure will get worsened. So that is the choosing the right beta blocker, the right titration pathways. SGLT2 inhibitors. This is it is not a drug to talk for me. It is for the diabetologist. But you know that SGLT2 inhibitors, glyphosins, are commonly used, and that is the current drug used in diabetes. What it does is it is in the proximal tubule. It reabsorption of the glucose. So it blocks the reabsorption in the proximal tubule. So sodium glucose co-transporter SGLT2 inhibitors are the new group of drugs for treating type 2 diabetes. It came as a type 2 diabetes, and now it has become a cardiac drug. How it happens? These drugs are the physiology of the reaphrone by inhibiting reabsorption of glucose in the kidneys, and therefore lowers the blood sugar. That is the action. They have been shown to provide significant cardiovascular benefits when they're used in diabetic patients. It reduced mortality, it reduced heart failure readmissions in the patients when they were treating these patients. Therefore, the empagliflozin became empagliflozin and dapagliflozin 10 milligram empagliflozin and dapagliflozin 10 milligram now approved to be used in heart failure with reduced ejection fraction because they significantly reduce cardiovascular mortality and hospitalizations. Therefore, it has become one of the drugs to be used in heart failure. So mineralocorticoid receptor antagonist, the next drug, it is the spironolactone. When you are using spironolactone, you have to be careful about the serum potassium. If the serum potassium is high, you reduce a smaller dose. Usual dose is 25 milligram and maximum dose is 50 milligram per daily. You don't give 100, 200 milligrams of spironolactone. You have to give a smaller dose, 25 milligram start and maximum 50 milligram. If the patient's serum potassium is high, start with a lesser dose and less frequency. Spironolactone causes common side effects is gynecomastia. So when these patients develop gynecomastia, you cannot continue this drug. They will go on complaining about this pain and swelling at the breast. In that case, you can use eplerenone. Eplerenone is another drug which does not have that effect on the gynecomastia and breast tenderness. So that is another drug which is also available here, 25 milligram, maximum 50 milligram. So new therapeutic sequence. So one on this side, the conventional sequencing. So this is how we have been treating heart failure. The recommendation was start with an AC inhibitors, ARBs. Then you add the beta blocker after 2 to 4 weeks. Then another 2 to 4 weeks, you add the spironolactone. And another 2 to 4 weeks, if ARNI is available, you convert the AC inhibitor ARB to ARNI. And then you add the SGLT2 inhibitors. It takes about few months to years to convert this. But this had been found that we are wasting time unnecessarily without giving a good drug in a short period. So now we have the proposed new sequencing. New sequencing means it is the accelerated sequencing. We quickly, within a month, you add all 4 drugs to this patient. Start with a beta blocker, and first you give the diuretics and offload the patient, make him symptom free, then start beta blocker, then SGLT2 inhibitors has come up in the line, and then you add ARNI. Instead of ARNI, we can get AC inhibitors or ARBs, and then add the spironolactone. So this within 4 weeks, you give all 4 drugs, and this has shown to reduce mortality in the first month itself. That is why it is the treatment you have to be accelerated. This is the proposed new sequencing in the management of heart failure, chronic heart failure. So other evidence-based medicines in heart failure with reduced ejection fraction is digoxin, may be considered in symptomatic patients in sinus rhythm despite all other treatments to reduce both all-cause and heart modulation, digoxin. Another drug is the hydralazine and ISDN combination. We don't have that combination. That is a combined drug. It can be considered in selected group of patients, not all patients. It is selected group of patients. It's in a black people with ejection fraction less than 35% or 45 combined with dilated left ventricle and reduced heart failure, hospitalization and death. So in a selected group of patients. Or in another drug is vericiguat. It is a new drug which is available. That is a vasodilated drug, soluble guanylate cyclase receptor, increases cyclic inhibitor patients who had worsening heart failure despite all other treatment. That is another new drug available in management of heart failure in selected group of patients. But you have to remember the 4 foundation drugs. Another drug which can be used in heart failure is the ivabradine, which you all know in heart failure. It reduces rehospitalizations. In symptomatic patient, it is selectively blocks the sinus node and reduces the heart rate. If the patient has sinus tachycardia, you give this drug, it can reduce the sinus heart rate. But we are giving beta blockers. So if the patient is on beta blockers and maximum tolerated dose, and still if the heart rate is above 70, you can add ivabradine to these patients. Or if a patient cannot tolerate beta blockers due to some reasons, some people will not tolerate beta blockers, or if they have asthmatic and you will not give these patients, then you can start ivabradine. 5 milligram BD is the recommended dose. You can go up to 7.5 milligram BD, and it was shown in the SHIFT trial. Once you give the foundation therapy, some patients will may need further treatment by device therapy. One of those device therapies, implantable cardioverter defibrillator, like a pacemaker. You insert a ICD that has the patients, the ECGs I show, the patients who are getting ventricular arrhythmias will be shocked by the machine. Or you can cardiac resynchronization therapy. That is another mode of therapy. The ECG I showed where there was a left bundle branch block. When there is left bundle branch block, there is a conduction abnormality. In the right ventricle and left ventricle, there is dysynchrony. It doesn't contract at the same time. There is a time gap. So you measure the QRS width in a patient with a left bundle branch block. And if the QRS width is above 150 or 130, we know that there is a dysynchrony, and those type of patient will definitely develop by putting a cardiac resynchronization therapy machine into this patient that has two leads, one in the right side, one on the left side, and the heart start contracting synchronously. So we synchronize the ventricular contraction. That improves ejection fraction and that reduces mortality. So this is the pathway when there is low ejection fraction. When the ejection fraction is low, less than 35%, if the QRS width is less than more than 150, it's a definite indication for patient for CRT. Sometimes these machines have CRT plus an ICD. That is called CRT-D. That machine has both a CRT machine synchronization as well as a ICD, a defibrillator is available. So these are expensive modes of treatment in patients with heart failure. Heart failure patients have other comorbidities. You can have sarcopenia, diabetes, COPD, anemia, cachexia, renal dysfunction, liver dysfunctions, obesity, all these should be tackled. This patient, as I said earlier, come with atrial fibrillation. So they can have recurrent atrial fibrillations and they should be on anticoagulation. So they should be on warfarin or other NOAC type of drugs. Ventricular arrhythmias, these patients can end up with sudden cardiac deaths. So these patients should be on ICD. They can have chemo. The patients are maybe most of these patients may have on chemotherapies. Therefore, they can have dilated cardiomyopathy and heart failure. So management of cancer and heart failure is a complicated problem, chemotherapy and heart failure. Infections. These patients can have recurrent infections, and these patients should be given prophylactic vaccination. Pneumococcal and influenza vaccination is recommended to these patients with heart failure, and even COVID vaccine. Now we come to a complete different category of patients, heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. All this time I have been talking to the heart failure with reduced ejection fraction, dilated, enlarged heart with low ejection fraction. Now we are seeing a heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. The ejection fraction is more than 40%, 50% like that one. So they call it's a black hole in cardiology. You know what is black hole? It's some black space in the black hole in the space where you don't know what's happening there. You go there, you get attracted and you get lost. So incomplete understanding of the disease, the preserved ejection fraction. Nearly half the patient with heart failure belongs to this category, because heart failure with preserved ejection fraction is nearly half, 50% of the patients. They have normal ejection fraction, and their prognosis is worse than the heart failure with ejection fraction. Why? They are the mode of treatment. We don't use all those 4-pillar treatment and cardiac resynchronization therapy. All those are not indicated in this type of patients. They are studied and proven in reduced ejection fraction. No specific therapies have been proven to reduce mortality in this group of patients. There is no specific treatment. You give diuretics, patient comes with heart failure symptoms, you give diuretics, they get better and they go home. And the other treatments are not proven to reduce mortality or hospitalization. Therefore, now the SGLT2 inhibitors have become the new standard of treatment for heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. So that is the new drug. It has become a cardiac drug. Molecular mechanisms, modulation of the cardiomyocyte with these drugs. It reduces oxidative stress, reduces inflammation, reduces myocyte stiffness, reduces extracellular matrix remodeling, and it reduces concentric hypertrophy. These mechanisms have helped these patients to reduce mortality in these patients with cardiac failure with preserved ejection fraction. So now, how to treat heart failure with preserved ejection fraction? Diuretics are recommended to alleviate symptoms and signs. A patient comes with heart failure, you give diuretics, they get better. Then ACE inhibitors, ARBs, ARNI, MRA, beta blocker, the 4-pillar drugs may be considered to reduce the risk of heart failure, hospitalization, death. But that does not reduce, definite proof is not there in this preserved ejection fraction. But the EMPEROR-reduced trial, empagliflozin convincingly reduced the combined risk of CV death, hospitalization of heart failure patient with ejection fraction more than 40%, regardless of the presence of absence of diabetes. Whether they are diabetic or not diabetic, you have to give this drug they have given this drug and found that mortality is reduced. Therefore, it has become a cardiac drug now. Started as a diabetic drug and become a cardiac drug. Preserved HF trial, where dapagliflozin 10 milligram for 12 weeks significantly improved patient-reported symptom, physical limitation, exercise functions. There was a small trial done in USA, and it has shown benefit. Another trial like Emperor reduced, equally done, deliver trial. Dapagliflozin in patient with heart failure with pre ejection fraction is scheduled to be published in 2022. So when these trials come, definitely the empagliflozin and dapagliflozin is going to become the primary treatment in the management of heart failure with reduced ejection fraction. If the patient is diabetic, definitely you will give. But if the patient is not diabetic, still you have to give. These patients should be in the guidelines very soon, probably in January. Advanced heart failure. Many heart failure patients progress into a phase of advanced heart failure. Whatever you do, whatever pillar treatment you give, whatever device you do, still they have maximum treatment given, but still they are symptomatic. Those are end-stage heart failure. The prevalence is increasing due to growing number of patients with heart failure, aging the population, and better treatment and survival of heart failure patients. All these drugs cause better survival, and they end up in a category of patients, whatever we have been done by according to trials, still the symptoms are getting worse. This is a poor prognosis. 1 year mortality is up to 75%. What do you do these patients? So mechanical circulatory support is available. It's a left ventricular assist device. So you can see in this picture on the right corner, it is inserted into the left ventricle, and there's a pump outside the body that pumps the blood into the aorta. That pump is doing the left ventricle's work, and that the patient will have to wear, as I shown in the picture, LVAD. LVAD is the left ventricular assist device. So this has a long-term therapy for up to 5 years patient had been using, and it can be a bridge to heart transplant. So till the patient gets the transplant heart, patients are on this LVAD treatment for heart failure. That is the advanced treatment in the management of heart failure. Very costly. We don't have this type of devices in our Sri Lanka. Take home message. What is the take home message here? Cure, or prevent. It is prevention. What the person I showed here is Professor Christian Barnard, who is the first cardiac transplant surgeon from South Africa. What he did 150 transplants for the patients with heart failure. After that, what did he say? If I had concentrated on heart disease prevention rather than saving the lives of 150 people, I could have saved lives of 150 million people. So prevention of heart disease is more important than doing a cardiac transplant. So he was actually telling, if I had done the prevention, I would 50 heart transplants. Therefore, in this pyramid, what you see from the baseline, start from the baseline. What you see in the baseline, high risk of developing heart failure, hypertension, coronary artery disease, diabetes, dyslipidemia, family history of cardiomyopathy. You treat these patients in the stage A because they are asymptomatic. That is the place where the people are with you. And they become asymptomatic heart failure in the second category, B category. The previous myocardial infarction, LV systolic dysfunction, they have low ejection fraction, little low ejection fraction, and they have valvular diseases, aortic stenosis, mitral stenosis, and these things. These patients should be managed at that stage. The pillar drugs, the 4 pillar drugs can be started one by one. If they become symptomatic heart failure, non-structural heart disease, shortness of breath, they become class 2 on the symptoms. It becomes class 3, and finally they go to the apex of the pyramid, refractory end-stage heart failure, where we are going for advanced treatment, cardiac transplant, and all those things we are talking about, LVAD and things. The pyramid is the wide base. You have to start treating these patients at the My references are from ESC guidelines for the diagnosis and treatment of acute chronic heart failure in 2021, and in 2021 update on ACC guidelines, and these two are references you can read up for further reference. Thank you for attention.
So we are just a little bit beyond the scheduled time. We have another 3 more items, but then I think we can do some parallel processing. Is Merck ready for the presentation? They have a small presentation of 2 minutes. Merck. Okay, so until that such time, I want to give our speakers the token of appreciation to Dr. Tushara Matias. Thank you so much. And then Dr. Mubrak. The Merck is not yet ready.
We're celebrating our 350th anniversary.
Time for the vote of thanks. Please.
Looking back, it's easy to take it all for granted. The discoveries, the developments,
Sorry.
and the many achievements. But progress wasn't only our goal, it was also our reward. From the dawn of modern science, the birth of our company, to our arrival in the new digital age. 350 years of defining the future. Today, more than ever, we continue to embrace tomorrow. And together with our partners, we pursue our curiosity, push boundaries, and explore the unknown. Discovering answers to questions that have not yet been asked. Here's where it starts to get interesting. Where Eureka becomes, that's funny. Where vibrant science and technology come to life. And where new ideas are born. Here's to the future. Here's to curiosity. Always curious. Imagine the next 350 years.
There's a very short Q&A session. If there are any questions, I think the speakers would be ready before we go for the vote of thanks. Anyway, we are a little bit too short of time. Are there any questions? I have a small question from dyslipidemia, topic on dyslipidemia in management of hypertriglyceridemia. In a case of obesity, what is the limit at which you will first start the dietary treatment rather than going for the statins? If the level is somewhere around 400, I suppose probably you would go for the drugs. In the management of obesity associated with hypertriglyceridemia. If anything more than 135, you would go for the drug treatment rather than the lifestyle modification. Okay, thank you, because that's a problem which I had faced in our practice. Are there any more questions? Then shall we go for the vote of thanks, please?
There are some questions from online. We are on hybrid.
There's anonymous. What about the risk of developing diabetes in long-term statin use? That's a question.
There was a recent meta-analysis which said that the risk is non-significant. So as at the moment, there is no long-term risk. Sorry. As at the moment, the risk is not clinically significant. The HbA1c increase is not significant, but you're supposed to screen patients on statin therapy long-term with HbA1c. And there is no specific statin, there is no difference between the statins. That's what they have asked. There is no difference between the statins.
That's a question, I think, the answer which I touched during your presentation. Is that harmful to low?
At the moment, 40 is not at risk. Yeah, maybe evidence will change in the future. At the moment, 40, up until 40, it's okay.
And there is a compliment for you also, Tushara, by somebody already. Thank you for the good.
So they've asked whether actually we reduce and see. That's something I do in practice. So if the patient actually sometimes the minute you combine ezetimibe with a statin, the patients have a drastic reduction of LDL. And they come back with about, when they start off with about 200 and thing, they come back with about 70 to 90. And then actually you can reduce the statin and see, because there is no indication to continue statin at a very high dose. I mean, if the LDL level is reached, so you can actually reduce the statin that you give and see whether the patient remains at that target. You can actually reduce it and see. That's what they have asked.
Titrating the statin dose according to the level of the.
It's not recommended.
It's not
Yes, but the problem is now if you're starting giving a very high dose like 80, sometimes we send patients with MIs and all that. And then when they come back, they have very low LDL. So if they have come to their target, you can actually reduce to 40 and see. I don't see harm in doing that.
Okay, thank you.
On behalf of the Independent Medical Practitioners Association of Sri Lanka, it gives me a pleasure to give the vote of thanks as requested by our President, Dr. Ananda Perera, because our secretaries both were not here. So I am the immediate past president, so I'm glad to give the vote of thanks today. First and foremost, I would like to thank our two speakers, Dr. Mrs. Tushara Matthias and Dr. Mubarak, MR Mubarak, for fantastic, excellent presentation of coming to know a lot of things that we didn't know in the past. And it just reminds me that in the past, you used to think that only 10% what you learn today is not correct in 10 years' time. We have been able to, so that's the main reason we have to go in for regular medical update programs, and that's what the IMPA is doing. And another thing is we usually request you to give a summary of your lecture, but now thanks to Dr. Ananda Perera, we have upgraded our website such that it automatically goes into our website. Your whole program goes into our website. So anybody who wants to listen to it can listen to the lecture online through our website. And also I'm happy to note that today, due to the constraints of Corona, we had to restrict attendance to only 25 to 30 participants. But thankfully, we were able, because of our sponsors of this evening's program, Merck Sri Lanka, we are able to have this as a hybrid meeting. So there are quite a few people online also. And I would like to thank them for having joined our program. Now, before I complete, I would like to thank the people who organized the hybrid session. That is the company who is doing the online work for us. And also I'd like to now invite each and every one of you all for dinner in the restaurant. But today, unfortunately, we are not allowed to have cocktails, but we have arranged it in the IMPA room, because today is a day of mourning in Sri Lanka, in Colombo. So now let me invite each of you all for fellowship and dinner and cocktails. Thank you.